Welcome to biology. In this video, we're going to briefly go through some measurement that we will be using throughout this course. Now remember, in science, we always use the metric system. So if we are measuring length, we do not use inches and feet. Instead, we use meters. If we're measuring temperature, we're going to use degrees Celsius, and we are not going to use degrees Fahrenheit. So it's important to remember that the units that we use in science is always the metric system and not the traditional standard English system. Also, it's important to remember to always put units on any number that we write. So if we're talking about the length of something, make sure you are putting the actual unit of meters or centimeters at the end next to that number. It's also important to always use the correct instrument when we are measuring things in science. So if we are measuring temperature, we're using degrees Celsius for our unit, but the actual instrument to measure, we are using a thermometer. For time, of course, we're using a stopwatch or a clock, and we are measuring typically in seconds. If we're looking at volume, particularly volume of a liquid, we're going to use a graduated cylinder. And when we measure with a graduated cylinder, you look and measure from the bottom of the meniscus. The meniscus is a little curve at the very top edge of the liquid, because around the edges, the liquid's kind of clinging up the sides of the graduated cylinder. When we measure mass, we look at the scale. So we use a little digital scale instrument, and make sure that you always zero out the scale every single time before you use it, just in case there's a slight change in atmospheric pressure that's affecting our scales. You always want your data to be accurate. And then finally, if you are measuring length, you want to use meters. Typically, we're using centimeters or millimeters in this class, and you are going to use a ruler or a meter stick. Remember to always start at 0, so that way your measurement is, again, accurate. So what's that measurement? I'd like you to see if you remember how to use these instruments, and pause the video and see if you can come up with the correct measurement. For the graduated cylinder, all the way on the right, that is where we are measuring at the bottom of the meniscus. Remember, the meniscus is that little dip in the liquid right at the top level. So you want to have your eye level with the bottom of the meniscus. You do not pick up the graduated cylinder and hold it in the air. Leave the graduated cylinder directly on the tabletop. Bring your eye, scoot yourself down so you are eye level with the top edge of that meniscus, and read the measurement. Now in science, we try to be as accurate as possible. So it's important that you are reading from that bottom edge. When you look at the graduated cylinder, you can see some of the lines are really short and other lines go all the way across. Some of those lines that go all the way across have numbers attached and some do not. So if we look at the graduated cylinder, let's look and find the number 30 here on the bottom. And then if you find the next number up is 40 up here. So to figure out what each one of these little tick marks represents, you just count how many are in between. And there's actually 9 in between, so that means that is 10 between 30 and 40. Okay, so that means that each one of these little tick marks is representing 1. And this longer mark without a number attached, that means you're at 35. So our eye is at the bottom of the meniscus. We see 35, the next tick mark 36, our next tick mark 37. But the bottom of the meniscus falls between 36 and 37. So our number for this measurement would be 36.5, because we are guessing. We're saying it's not quite 36, it's not quite 37, it's 36.5. Remember to include the unit, which would be milliliters. Now for the next one, we have the length of this green bar. When we're looking at this, we are not saying that it is 1 inch long, because we do not measure in inches in science. Instead, we measure in meters. Particularly on this one, we're looking at centimeters. When you look at this ruler, again, each tick mark represents 1, but it doesn't represent one whole unit. It represents 0.1. So from 2 to 3, there's 9 ticks in between, 3 being the 10th tick, making it round up to 3. And we can see that this green line falls down here right about there. And so if each tick is worth 0.1, we have 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, 2.5, 2.6. So this green line is right about 2.6. But remember, in science, we guess for the last digit. So we would say 2.60 because we're saying it's right on 2.6. It's not longer, it's not shorter, it's right there. Then if we look at our thermometer, quiz yourself, is it Celsius or Fahrenheit? Well, in science we use Celsius. So this top level of the thermometer, that's where we measure to. And if we look across over here, it is right at 0. So we can say that it is at 0.0 degrees Celsius because we always guess that last digit. So double check, make sure you got the right answers. Now in science, we have a series of base units that we use. If we're measuring mass or the weight or amount of space that something takes up, we're using grams. If we're looking at volume, we use liters. If we're looking at length, we use meter. If we look at temperature, we're using degrees Celsius. And if we're looking at time, we use seconds. Now these are our base units. We can use this handy dandy prefix scale to convert between each of these base units. So if you have a very small amount of liquid, like our 36.5 milliliters that we measured in that graduated cylinder. Well, if I'm talking about the volume, using 36.5 milliliters sounds a whole lot better than 0.00365 liters. It just makes the numbers a little bit easier to work with when you use the appropriate prefix. Now to convert between prefixes, all you're doing is moving the decimal point. This is something that you should have done in past science classes, so I am not going to go through this right now. If you don't understand this, please send me your questions and I will help you work through all of this. But for the sake of time, I'm going to skip that right now. In this class, you are going to have to do quite a bit of graphing. Pretty much every single lab requires you to make a graph. And I want to make sure that you know the basics of labeling a graph and where all the parts are. So the x-axis, and you should know this from math class, is the horizontal axis, and the y-axis is the vertical axis. That should be review. You should know that. I want to remind you the title always goes at the top of the graph, and every single graph that we make has a title. And when you set up your graph, you always put your independent variable along the x-axis and your dependent variable along the y-axis. Now in some experiments, you might have multiple lines going on your graph. Some might be a single line. Very, very rarely will I ask you for a bar graph. 90% of the time it's going to be a line graph. So just make sure that you know how to set up your graph appropriately and you include all of the pieces. Now a very brief summary here. Always use the metric system in science. That's my summary. That's it. Make sure that you're using the metric system. Make sure you are collecting data appropriately, keeping it stored in a logical manner, and that you create beautiful graphs that are clear and easy to understand and read. That's my summary. Now I know this was a fair amount of information. Please leave your questions here, send them to me so that way I can respond to you and help you better understand each of these pieces. If you're still a little struggling with the prefixes for the metric system, please let me know and I'll spend some time working with you to help that make more sense. And I hope that you learned something as you watch this video.